All right, happy Friday, everybody. It's your host, John Solheid here on Patristic Cast, and today I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Christian Hankstermann. Did I pronounce your name correctly, Hankstermann?
Yes.
Dr. Hengstermann, you are a Lehrbeauftragter. Is that a lecturer? Or
yeah, associate lecturer.
Lecturer, okay. In classical philology, correct? At the Universität Wuppertal. And I had to look that up. I've never heard of that town before. It looks like it's just a little north of Cologne.
Geography is not my strength, I'm afraid. I don't know actually, so Just take the train there.
Okay. On the map, it looks like it's in between Cologne and Munster, kind of in that area. So.
Yeah.
Where are you from originally?
Ruhr area. We call it Bottrop.
Okay.
You may not have heard of that before.
Nope.
No, exciting town.
Okay.
Yeah.
My ancestors, the Solheid family, comes from a very small town, Vaxweiler, which is right. I think it's right by the border with Luxembourg. So not too far from Clairvaux, I don't think. Or yeah, Clairvaux, I think. I can't remember. Anyway, it's in that region somewhere. So small town family as well. Well, anyway, we're here today to talk about your book, Origenes und der Ursprung der Freiheitsmetaphysik, Origin and the Beginnings of Metaphysics of Freedom, that you published a few years back, 2016, I think.
Yes.
Before we get into the book, I've always been curious about the guy in the front. When I see this guy, I think he must be like a Dutch Renaissance guy or a Dutch humanist, maybe like Erasmus or something. But is that anybody in particular?
Yeah, it's Origen.
It's Origen. It's
a humanist painting, so pretty rare. Okay. So my supervisor came across it and he purchased the rights for his series of collection of publications on Origen.
Yeah.
I think it's a great find, right?
It's wonderful, actually. I love it. And it's the same cover, on all the series in this collection. Your supervisor, Alphonse Fierst, right?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, he was in the audience when I gave a paper at Oxford a couple of years ago, and I was like, I better not mess up too much with him in the audience. I was a little nervous. That was my first real big presentation.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Freiheitsmetaphysik, Metaphysics of Freedom. You situate Origen's theology or metaphysics of freedom. You say reality for Origen is presented as a dynamic continuum of purposeful, zielgerichte, intellectual freedoms. So there's a dynamic of freedom that's going on, and throughout your book, you posit this dynamic as, on the one hand, God's own freedom and then human freedom. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Exactly, yes. This is so striking about Origen. He's the first Platonic theologian ever to actually call God freedom. He calls the Father in particular unbegotten freedom twice in his extant works. And that's extremely interesting, right? It's not the first attribute of the divine you think of when doing speculative metaphysics. And when it comes to the fleshing out of this concept, he draws on a great variety of sources. So clearly, as a Platonist, he subscribes to this higher realm of reality, a reality entirely incorporeal in nature, but he's also a Stoic to a great extent. So that makes it so interesting. So God's freedom is a univocal freedom. So it's predicated of him in the same way it is predicated of us. That is, he's the embodiment of the first moral categories that are accessible to us, to our minds. So we can really understand God by looking at our moral categories, by really understanding them, by coming up with moral rules and norms, values, and the like. And this has always struck me as something systematically appealing. So my background is in Kantian philosophy.
I saw
interesting.
That. I feel sorry for you. That's just better.
Yeah.
Kant is not easy.
Yeah, no, I love Kant. I can't deny that. So, but I think Origen is a close second when it comes to the commitment to divine and human freedom, and that's exciting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially when it comes to the relationship between unbegotten divine freedom and begotten human freedom, mm-hmm. right? Because God is a freedom that cannot but communicate itself, and this is an idea that has always appealed to me when it comes to the Neoplatonic tradition, right? So this idea of goodness being self-diffusive in nature. And this is something that Origen draws on. He adds this idea of divine and human univocity in virtue. Mm-hmm. And I think the blend of these traditions is of remarkable consistency and compelling when it comes to the contents of this new and really original metaphysics.
And you nicely situate the historical philosophical context. Origen is not thinking in a vacuum here. He's not just making up ideas by himself, but he's situated within philosophical debates over fate, astrological determinism, and you position that very nicely. Can you talk a little bit about these philosophical debates that were happening, roughly contemporaneous with Origen?
Yes. So what is vitally important for him is the dispute with the Gnostics, right? So he engaged in a constant dialogue with the Valentinians, who were basically state-of-the-art theologians, right? So they were the first ones to provide a scientific reading of the Holy Writ, right? They came up with the first very sophisticated religious philosophy that drew both on scripture and reason, right? And of course, he engaged in dialogue with all the major philosophical schools of that day, right? So with the Platonists, obviously, so Aristotle is not as important as Plato, but he does play a role in Origen's work too. And above all, he engaged critically with the Stoic tradition. Mm-hmm. So as is well known, perhaps, Origen is the author of the first Christian treatise on human freedom. And interestingly enough, he basically reproduces a Stoic source. So he draws on the doxographic tradition to provide this first major defense of human freedom. That's interesting because obviously the Stoics throughout act as a foil to his own project, right? But he uses their conceptual resources to come up with a consistent concept of freedom, but then, as it were, uses it against them. And that's extremely interesting.
Yeah, and he does it, you point this out, there are two almost identical verbatim discussions. Book Reeve on first principles. So that's the one on self-determination of the Ecclesion. And what is it, chapter 2 of De Ratione on prayer? Is it 2, or maybe it's a little bit later than that? But
I think it's 6.
6, okay.
But I'm not
6, not okay. That would make sense. Yeah. So there are very different discussions, though, in the starting points, anyways. Because on first principles, the question is behavior, conduct. Are we responsible for our behavior, or is it determined by fate or a doctrine of natures, as the Stoics would have it? And on prayers, it's a different question that's being asked. If things are predetermined, what use is it for prayer? But this Stoic argument that he makes is very central to both cases.
Yes,
that's very striking. And then his, you also referred to the fragment of his commentary on Genesis, Genesis 1:14, the stars that were established as signs, and you could tell that Origen was very troubled and annoyed by people who thought that, who believed in various forms of determinism.
Yes, definitely.
So his starting point, and I think you point this out, is the ecclesiastical preaching. And so he takes it as an a priori that God is a just judge, which means that we are responsible for our human actions. That's his starting point. Can you talk a little bit That's very interesting, because he's using these different philosophical sources, but he's mapping them onto a biblical framework of reality.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that? I think that's a very striking observation.
Yeah, it most certainly is, right? No, obviously it's a very intricate blend of philosophy and the Holy Writ, so there's no denying that. And he purports to expound scripture by doing these things. No, you have already mentioned these two treatises, and it's striking. Well, there are 6 chapters devoted to the concept of freedom, and we've got some 20 or more devoted on difficult passages in the Holy Writ that seem to impugn human freedom, right? Yeah. No? But I completely agree with your reading. So the starting point in Origen clearly is divine goodness. And in order to hold on to divine goodness, and this is where the Gnostics come into play again, we need to have a strong libertarian concept of freedom, because difference cannot be due to God, who is pure oneness, pure goodness. So it must be due to the creatures themselves. And this is where freedom comes into play. So it's probably my favorite treatise in the On First Principles, the one on motion and its origin. So it's not as well known as it should be, but there he points that out quite succinctly. He says, if difference originates in God, then the Gnostics are right, because I can't hold on to divine goodness and justice anymore. And judging from the fact that our world obviously is characterized by egregious differences between, as he says, races, right? So the question of race is actually a pivotal concern of his. So it strikes us as quite modern, right? His sensitive approach to differences among people, right? And this is actually a starting point.
Yes.
And only if I can trace this back to human freedom can I justify the ways of God to man. That's his argument.
Because he's responding to an argument, I think, in book 2 of On First Principles.
Yeah.
Where people are talking about, why is there so much diversity in the world? If God is good, why are there people who kill their own children or kill their own parents, who engage in these wicked customs? Is God the cause of this? That was a very central debate at the time, and he's saying no. And then he's trying to articulate defense of that. You make a very important observation. So in this dynamic of two freedoms, it reminds me of, I cannot remember her name. She has a monograph called Vernunft gemäße Glaube. I think she was a Benedictine. And she talks about Origen as having...
Reims?
Reims, that's right. Thank you. Reims, that's right. She calls it a meeting of two freedoms. Which is striking. And if we think about God's freedom here, we have to think about it in, for Origen, God was not limitless per se. He said, so you mentioned goodness, God is goodness, but that's not an accidental quality on God's part. God is like goodness with the capital G. And if that's his nature, he can't do anything wicked. So God can't do everything. He's got limits. Whereas freedom for us is an accidental quality. That's a very important distinction Origen makes, and I think you draw that out quite nicely in your book. Now, one of the central concepts, and you've talked about Origen's Stoic discourse here. One of the central concepts is the to ef hemen, that which is up to us, basically, is kind of what that means. The cause of our sin or virtue is within ourselves. Can you talk a little bit about to ef hemen and how Origen applies that?
No, and it's great that you're asking this question, right? Because we tend to talk about freedom a lot without really defining it. No?
Do whatever you want. That's great.
No, because it always has a nice ring to it, right? So it sounds nice, basically. Yes, But this is the technical term used in the de fato debate in antiquity, ephemein, right? So what is due to us, right? What is up to us, basically? No? The problem is how to define it. And as we know from contemporary discussions, right, this might be the most difficult part of the debate, right? You need to come up with a consistent concept of freedom, or what is up to us first. And this is where the Stoic sources come into play, on which Origen draws. And he links it to various other concepts that have to do with the Stoics' doctrine of oikeiosis, right? No, kathekon is an important concept in that regard, and krisis, judgment, right, which is a pivotal term in Chrysippus, that is with the old, the first Stoics, right, and with Epictetus, one of Origen's favorite writers. And freedom does not mean I can do whatever I feel like doing, right? And Origen follows the Stoics in rejecting such a kind of freedom. It wouldn't be freedom at all. It would basically be caprice, right? Which is the opposite of freedom. Freedom is judgment. So whenever we act according to judgments, and it's up to us to refine these judgments, based on reason, right? We need to check these judgments, because we can never be sure, is it God or Satan talking to us, right? Tempting us, or showing us the good that we need to pursue. So everything we do, we are accountable for, because we are identical with the highest epistemic power in us. So he's a Stoic monist through and through when it comes to the origins of all our actions. And true freedom is achieved when we cannot but act in accordance with reason. This is where divine and human freedom finally match. So the closest we can come to God is by acquiring a character, a hexis, that is immutable, because we are so committed to the good that we can't deviate from it any longer. And this is where to ephemein or to aut exousion, so he uses them synonymously, I'd say, is transformed into what the Stoics actually called freedom, our term, eleutheria. And that means he defines it, he follows Chrysippus, in fact. So in defining it as exousia tes autopragias, that is the power of self-action, because once we've reached that state, that perfection, we ourselves are the source of our every action. And this is the highest aim inscribed into ephemein, as the possibility of choosing between good and evil.
Right. And so for anybody who does modern psychology, like cognitive behavior psychology, would say that Origen had a very strong internal locus of control, they say it. So rather than an external locus of control. We are not compelled by external forces to act in certain ways. And you start to see here, where you've talked about this kind of struggle between whether something is from God or from the devil or the demons. And you start to see here the sort of philosophical underpinnings of a later monastic practice of the discernment of spirits, where to ephemein, is, and within the hegemony kon, you bring this out very well in your book, which Origen often kind of parallels with the biblical heart. This is the seat where that process unfolds. So he's applying, metaphysics, but also a very strong Stoic moral psychology in his understanding of freedom, wouldn't you say?
Exactly. And I think it's one of the key questions that needs to be answered in Origen's scholarship. So the extent of his Stoicism and the extent of his Platonism, because he's far more of a Stoic, again, strangely enough, right, in these writings. So when talking about Origen, the Christian Platonist, you would expect a treatise more along the lines of, say, 6.8, Plotinus's Aeneas 6.8, right? So with a firm focus on the divine intellect and things like that, but you can't find it there. So he's a Stoic when it comes to his theory of action, right? And there's no denying that fact, right? And that's extraordinary. And I found that disappointing when first reading Origen. So I was absolutely disappointed when reading these first 6 chapters. But what is great is the way he introduces his Platonism into this Stoic theory, and it's important for the final objective that is part of human reason, according to his innermost convictions, as it were, you see. Whereas the Stoics subscribe to a cycle of worlds, right? The world keeps on repeating because it is perfect as it is. He subscribes to an ideal world that cannot be identical with the real world, and is absolutely crucial to his philosophical project. No? And this is where they part ways.
The Stoic doctrine of conflagrations, isn't that right? Where
exactly.
The world ends and then it repeats. And in Contra Pelsum, Origen says, well, that's kind of absurd, because then Socrates would come back and do this very things. And he says, no, that's not quite right. And yet he's very convinced by their moral psychology, their understanding of human behavior and human cognition. So you bring this out in your book with the Toef Hemen. I love this passage in On First Principles, because he sets out this hierarchy of beings, right? So sticks and stones can only move from outside. And then he says, but like a spider, an image, fantasia arises that triggers a horme, an impulse, and then the spider weaves a web. But they don't go through a reasoning process, whereas human beings do. That's that is such a fun discussion, to read the spider and the bee, who just act on image and impulse. But we have logos, reason. And then he uses that example, which is he likes to use real life examples. So he talks about that male ascetic, who's trying to live a chaste life. But then some woman comes and tries to put the moves on him, and he says, if he follows through with that, if he gives in, who's responsible for his behavior? It's not the woman, it's him. And then he says this is something where he gives assent in his hegemonicon. Can you talk a little bit about you write quite nicely about that in the book? Can you say a little bit more?
Again, I love that passage too, but it's taken straight from Chrysippus again. It's not even Origen's own example, strangely enough. We'd expect that, right? Considering that he's talking about an ascetic, right? Yes, but it's very important to add this concept to our discussion, right? Assent, right? So this is what is ephemen according to Stoic Orthodox opinion. Yes, no, and this where this distinction between a perfect course and an auxiliary course comes into play. So the women and her beauty are the auxiliary course, whereas my character, my hexis, is the perfect course. No? This where Chrysippus cites the example of a cylinder and another geometrical figure, right? So they roll down a hill in a different fashion because of their shape, right? The push comes from without, but the way these things move as a consequence, is wholly due to their character. And this is a nice way of putting it, because it clearly places the blame for our transgression on our shoulders, obviously, because it's our character. You see, a great compatibilist move that Origen uses for his Christian apologetics, right? For his Christian philosophy. No, it's our character. There's no denying that. But this is where the problem of where we got that character in the first place becomes so important for his theodicy, right? And this way diverges from the Stoics, and it has to, because that character is due to God ultimately. So the Stoics can subscribe to that, they can accept that, but the Christian Origen cannot, because of his concern with unity and diversity, right? God is pure unity, so the diversity must be due to us alone. And this is where the doctrine of preexistence comes into play. So it's us who give ourselves a character. We do so at the beginning, so we are to blame. So is the ascetic, even though he might have enjoyed bad education, say with some of the ancient peoples, right, mentioned in the Contra Pelsum passage.
And this is where you
had in mind.
This is where you tie in the importance of paideia, education. And it brings us back to a term you used earlier, katikon, which is it's conduct that's becoming, or that's befitting in a certain situation. I thought that was a very interesting discussion on the role of how Origen saw the role of education in the formation of our character, our ethics. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. It's the Stoic conundrum again, which he seeks to solve, right? So there are just three causes that govern our behavior, right? It's nature, no, it's education, and it's character. And clearly our character is formed by our nature and by our education. So once we make our first choice, our character is basically complete, you see. So the fault is not ours, strictly speaking, if we don't assume there to have been a prior state in which we acquired that character. It makes it so interesting. This turns education into the key concept of Origen's whole freedom metaphysics, I'd say, because he places it at the center of all things, right? It's all about paideia. Paideia is what Christianity is about, because this is a game changer for him. The fact that God himself becomes a teacher for our sake, right? And he's so successful a teacher that the good will ultimately prevail. That's his understanding. But
it's very optimistic. It's very optimistic.
Yeah. No, I don't actually. I don't think he's optimistic, because he posits almost infinitely many eons, because he's aware of the formidable challenge that poses. You see,
so he's a realist in that regard.
Yeah, exactly. So he was a preacher, right? So he was in charge of a congregation, and he was a teacher at a school, right? An advanced school, but a school nevertheless. So he was aware of the difficulties. No? And people don't like to change, right? They don't mend their ways at once, and this is why the Logos needs almost an infinity of time, which is quite a startling statement for an optimist.
Yes.
You see?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah.
I love that about him.
And he points out in book 3 of On First Principles, and you point this out in your book, that Origen identifies the radical effects of education, or the lack thereof. And he says people who have lived as brutes, as very irrational, through education they can actually acquire a great deal of virtue, whereas people who are cultivated individuals who've grown up educated, through laziness or whatever, they can lose that and almost live like animals, and it's what was it? I had a thought about that when I was reading your reflections on this. It's like, any athlete or a musician, for example. I played baseball growing up, and the more I played, the more I practiced, the more easily making plays came to me on the field. It was almost like second nature, muscle memory, conditioning. But when I took time off, I was very rusty when I would start up again. And I think that's what Origen is getting at here. Anybody who's learned a foreign language knows that if you stop learning the language and applying it, starting again is incredibly difficult. And I think that's what he's getting at, right?
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Yes. And that's the beauty of it. And this is what the Bible consists of, basically, right? It's divine pedagogy. So it's full of these examples that are meant to help us. So we need to meditate on Scripture every single day, right?
And he has this notion. So you talked about the pre-existence. So the soul, it's not properly right to say the pre-existence of souls, whereas it's more like the pre-existence of the rational intellect. And he says that through a process of cooling, sikao, we become siki, souls. So with Origen, you get the sense here that cooling off, being kind of dormant, not exercising your faculties, you can really slip. Whereas the heat, the more you're warmed up, to use athletic language, the stronger you are, the more virtuous you are.
Exactly.
It gives I hadn't thought about that until reading your book, about how he sees the sikao, as the cooling down into the soul, but then the heat, bring it. Anyway, I don't know where I was going with that, but
no, your example, right, of a baseball player, right?
Yeah.
So negligence is the root of evil, right?
Mhm.
So we neglect the vision of the divine, and
Right.
then it turns into something different, right? Because we don't have the complete insight anymore. No, so this is how error first and then sin come into the world, and I think it's a psychologically compelling account, right, of the fall. It clearly has its difficulties, and I think it's the most operatic part of his philosophy. But at least there's some rationale for it, I'd say, and it has to do with the baseball player. Yeah,
everything. Once you can apply modern situations, it does help to make sense of what these ancients were talking about.
Yeah.
He says in On First Principles, I forget where, maybe you know where it is, where he says that it would be better. So between like three options, one is practicing virtue, one is sitting in idleness, and another one is committing sins and continuing to get worse. And he says it would be better for the person to continue in their sin than to be idle, because the person who's idle is never going to wake up to the fact that they need help, whereas the person who is committing sins is eventually going to say, I need to change. That is such a fascinating way of looking at things.
No, couldn't agree more. And it's one of those startling insights in Origin. So evil is better than mediocrity.
Right.
That's the worst thing.
That's right. That is worse than sin itself almost. You make a striking claim about movement, kinesis. It's not an accidental quality, but it's the principle of our substance. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So he defines freedom as kinesis d how-to in the on prayer. So he fails to provide that term in the on first principles for whatever reason. Again, I found that surprising, but freedom is kinesis d how-to. So I myself am the sole cause of my movements, right, of my motions, and these motions take on a rational character once I've made the right fundamental choice for God and goodness per se. And what is so striking now is that on the principles of his university of divine and human virtue, he applies that concept to God himself. God is moved, and he moves. He engages in active motion. So this is a text I translated into German. I did so with my supervisor, Alphonse Fürst. And there he explicitly talks of motus Dei, which is a startling concept, right? So the movement or the motion of God. And he does so in defiance of Aristotle, obviously.
Because doesn't Aristotle define a soul as a substance that's always in motion? Is that right? I think.
Exactly. So this is why mediocrity is a theoretical concept only, because we cannot but move in the direction of evil or good. So again, it's derived from the Stoics and Socrates, right? So if I don't do anything, I inevitably deteriorate. So I move towards evil. So he says so in another passage in the On First Principles. So theoretically, there is a soul per se without any good and evil, but in actual fact, a soul is either good or evil. It's a Stoic, of course, right? So I have to move in one of these directions because it is my being. You see,
and that's why they attributed rational natures to stars and planets, right? Because they saw them in motion.
Exactly, and especially ordered motion, right? So the sun is a superior rational being, in fact.
That's right. So how does this all play out then? So you in your final, like in the second half of your book, which is probably the one I struggled with the most. God is the cause, right, of freedom. And there's this movement from the one, you say, to the many. So Einheit to Vielheit, and then
exactly.
back to Einheit. So
yes.
how does that process unfold in Origen's understanding of this drama?
Yeah. And this is what personally I find the most extraordinary about Origen. So where he said he applies the concept of motion to the divine itself, and it starts with the Father, right? So he is God per se, right? Ho theos, as opposed to theos in the case of the Son. No? And he's also unbegotten freedom, right? This extraordinary concept Origen uses twice in his homilies. No? And this freedom is univocal, so it's the same freedom that we possess. But of course, God possesses it in the best possible way because he's the most perfect being, right? And this is where his salvation Trinitarianism comes into play, because Christ or wisdom is called the beginning of God's ways or motions in the Holy Writ. And he takes this as a starting point for his theology of the Trinity, viewing Sophia or wisdom, that is the sum total of the Platonic forms, as the arche, the beginning or principle of God's motion. So God first creates the course of his motion, and that's the intelligible world, which is the archetype of the world he's about to create. And he communicates his fullness to us via that intelligible world.
And it's
so
free
Christ.
It has to be free communication, right?
Yes, exactly.
It's not by necessity that God does that.
No.
God does it because he wants to do it.
Exactly. Yes. And we need to accept it of our own free volition. So this is how he basically deduces freedom from a first theological insight, right? God is self-diffusive goodness. So he needs to create, and he needs to create rational agents, because only rational agents can either accept or reject the gift of divine goodness. No? And this is the realization of divine freedom. So he cannot but create and communicate his fullness to us, but it is an expression, or the expression, of his creative and salvific freedom. So it's an extraordinary concept, because in God's freedom, necessity and free will, as it were, coalesce. They are one, right? Because God cannot but do the good, and the good is this ungrudging self-communication. And again, you see, we have this blend of Christianity and Platonism, of course.
It's almost a logical paradox, necessity and freedom, that's almost impossible to really fully explain.
It depends on one's concept of freedom and how important one finds this idea of contingency in that case, no? Because the way Origen analyzes freedom, right, following the Stoics, true freedom doesn't admit of any choice. So it's actually specific to Eleutheria, that there is no choice anymore, because my character cannot change any longer. That's perfection. And of course, I have to predicate perfection of God's freedom.
Okay. All right. That helps.
So So he'd say the other line of reasoning, which is valid too, right? So if God cannot but create, cannot but act according to creative goodness, right? It's not a merit of his any longer and can't be called good, right? So this is a modern objection, right? So, and it is discussed to this day, right? But he'd reject this as an anthropomorphism, in fact, saying, well, this means applying our caprice again, right, to God, and we shouldn't do that, right? So God is not capricious. Yes,
that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Which is great, considering some passages from the Bible that may come to one's mind when.
Well, let's talk a little bit then about this in concrete terms, because going back to book 3, after he outlines his, he gives a rational account of freedom, he then gets exegetical. And the first case that he brings up must have been almost a stereotypical discussion in early Christianity and Judaism. if you're going to maintain that human beings are free and therefore responsible for their actions, how do you account for God hardening Pharaoh's heart?
Yeah.
And Origen gives a brilliant response to that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because the rain, he talks about the rain. Let's just talk about that a little bit.
No, Origen certainly rises to the occasion. I think there's no denying that, right?
Yes,
so,
he does, yeah.
Because God's motion is not different from ours. It actually consists in his ordering our motions, foreseen and foreordained in his wisdom. So God is aware of all our motions, right? Both psychological and bodily, right? And he foreordains them in such a fashion as ultimately contributes to the restitution of all things. And Pharaoh is a case in point. Clearly he's evil, according to the Old Testament account, but it's to the credit of God's motion that he basically makes the best of it, right? Having Pharaoh in his deliberate wickedness serve a providential purpose, right? He's the antagonist of Moses, and so allows Moses to showcase God's goodness and power in this very memorable, very epic struggle in the Old Testament.
That's right.
No? But of course, God is not to blame. He makes use of Pharaoh's evil, but the evil is entirely his. And at the same time, God constantly tries to help Pharaoh mend his ways, but in vain, as of course, foreseen.
That's right. He calls it the I have to try to find it here. The underlying element of evil, the hypokimenon.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
So he equates then. This is such a brilliant exegesis here. He says that when it rains, the rain is the same everywhere, but some ground has not been cultivated, and when the rain falls, it gets weeds. Whereas well-cultivated soil will, produce, green, lush, healthy grass.
Exactly.
Pharaoh. So God's miracles that he was working for the people simply exposed Pharaoh's evil that he had cultivated over many years. But he wasn't evil, but Origen wouldn't accept that he was evil by nature.
No.
Right. But he had developed this sense of evilness through habit. And that became exposed then through the miracles that God performed. It's just so God didn't harden in an active sense Pharaoh's heart.
No.
It's just
exactly. No, and he even calls it God's energia in the passage you have just quoted.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And you can't blame the rain, obviously, for producing weeds. No, it's the ground's fault.
And this gets back to the importance of education and cultivating virtue, right?
Exactly.
So education for Origen wasn't just learning arithmetic, although that would have been a part of it. Learning to read would have been a part of it, so grammar and literary pursuits. But almost as importantly is the cultivation of virtue in education, which gets back to this katikon notion that you pointed out. This was very helpful. You pointed out in your note that Diogenes Laertius links this back to who is it? Zeno, I think. The Stoic. Yeah,
and all the others. Yes, Chrysippus is the most important Stoic for Origen. The most important Stoic in his own right.
And so for Origen, then you have another chapter in your book, from Bild to Gleichnis, from image to likeness, and this is sort of the anthropological movement. So Origen has this interpretation of Genesis 1:26. And he must be following Stoic grammar, if I'm correct here, because he says, in the first it says, "Let us make man in our image and according to our likeness." But then in the very next sentence it says, "God made him in his image," but he leaves out the likeness. And Origen says, if you follow
on purpose, of course.
On purpose, that's right. So this is that a part of Stoic theory of language? Do you know?
I don't know actually. So, but I think he only focuses on this glaring omission, right? Because everything Scripture does, it does on purpose, obviously, and this omission points to our freedom again, right? Because it's up to us to develop the original image into the eschatological likeness, and then even a union with the divine.
And you make this on page 89. You have a striking quote that has to do with the image and the likeness. Let's see here. Or no, wait a second. That's not, you're not quite at the image and likeness yet with page 89, but I think it's related anyway. So I'm going to quote it here. The question of freedom is inextricably linked to the dignity of the individual. It is not the virtue that has already been realized, but rather the mere ability of the individual to achieve virtue, according to the measure of the good and the befitting. So human dignity, which you tie in with the image, doesn't pertain to whether or not somebody has achieved virtue, but simply the fact that they are capable of virtue.
Exactly.
Can you say a little bit more about that? That is
no, it's our capacity for perfection that makes us infinitely valuable. Origin. There's a striking passage in the Contra Celsum too, where it says, "So man must never be compared to any animal."
Yeah.
So
because Celsus compares Christians and Jews to worms, right? You bring up that discussion in here.
Yeah, and Origen really gets angry at Celsus at this stage. He's not a very polemical author, all in all, but this is one of the very few passages in his work, where he actually is very angry.
You can really sense his anger at that,
Yeah, exactly, because we're all part of this one divine motion, right? So we are images of God, and therefore are entitled to this absolute respect. And it has to do with this capacity, right, which no one can take away from us.
That's right.
Again, because it's a substantial part of our very being, so we can't forfeit it. There's nothing we can do that takes away from us this privilege.
The image is permanent.
Exactly.
But I think he does say in one of his homilies on Genesis that it can be obscured, but it can never be lost. It can never be lost. So the most violent criminal in the world still has the image, even though it has been tarnished to almost the point where it's unrecognizable.
Yeah. Now, this is why Origen is such an important thinker, right? So first of all, we have to give the Stoics the due again, right? So they were the ones to come up with this universal dignity, but then Christianity took up this important insight, right? And Origen is at the forefront of these developments, and this is an excellent case in point. So you mentioned Pharaoh, right? So this is what I love about Origen. He actually talks about Pharaoh after he has drowned, you see, because God doesn't give up Pharaoh's soul either, because Pharaoh clearly is an image of God too, and he too will be part of the restitution of all things. God knows. And the drowning itself, by the way, is a pedagogical measure as well. So it's not just a punishment, it's capital punishment, but after that he's given a new chance of
it's remedial. God's punishment is remedial, absolutely, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
I think this oftentimes gets overlooked, and I just told you about this paper that I wrote. And Origen does say some very disparaging things sometimes about other cultures. He talks about, who is it, the Scythians or the Parthians who practice fratricide or patricide? I can't remember. And so some people might say, well, this is racism. This is Origen saying disparaging things. He's prejudiced against other ethnic groups. And I think that obscures this fundamental anthropological insight that you bring out in your book, that no, I mean, there's an intrinsic dignity that cannot be completely lost, that transcends racial or gender markers of identity, right?
Exactly.
It has human worth. There is this intrinsic human worth, but then we are responsible for acting in a particular way. So we're dignified beings, act like it, is what Origen might say.
Exactly.
You talk about it, and I can't remember where. I'm going to have to see if I could find where you say it here. You say, and I can't remember the page, making excuses for our behavior denies our rationality. Since rationality is the very principle of our being, making excuses for our behavior denies our humanity. I mean, that's
exactly.
just a striking statement, that if people who make excuses, like this ascetic guy that Origen brings up, if he were to blame this woman, well, she was leading me on and this and that, he would be denying his humanity, his humanness there.
Exactly, yeah. And he has a valid philosophical point, because prior to that, he defines human nature as self-motion, motion through itself, kinesis, how to.
That's right.
So he has to draw this conclusion, however counterintuitive. That's great, right? So if we are motion, and if we deny it, we deny by implication our humanity.
And this has such profound ramifications for not just morality and ethics, but for public policy.
Exactly.
I mean, policies that are instituted, even on good grounds, like even for good intent. I'm probably going to alienate viewers here, but I think this is something I've been. I think this is something I've been thinking about. Policies that are oftentimes meant to help people actually have counter effects, unintended consequences that actually deprive them of their agency.
Exactly.
I've been, racism has been such a huge conversation, in recent years, and there's no denying individual racists. They're out there, anybody, it's plain as day. Yep. But I've been reading a couple of authors, Thomas Sowell and Shelby Steele, a couple of Black men who grew up in Jim Crow era. And they point to one powerful contributing factor in modern disparate outcomes, particularly between Blacks, Hispanics, and white people. And they say so many of these disparate outcomes are part of a reversal that happened in the 1960s. We get Lyndon Johnson with the Great Society reforms, and he stands up in front of Howard University in 1965, and he says we can't expect people who who've been in chains for so long to be at the same starting point than people who haven't been. So we're going to help you get there. And that was the philosophical basis for the welfare state and affirmative action. Yep. And what's happened instead is that the Black family has completely disintegrated. I mean, we're at like 75%, I think, of Black people grow up in single parent homes. At the poverty level, there's a substantial proportion of them are at the poverty level, increased crime and violence. And Shelby Steele has this fascinating observation. He said, and I'm going to paraphrase here, while they intended to benefit the Black community, what these people did in effect was deprive us of our agency. And what he's getting at there is they've deprived us of our humanity. Yeah. And I think that's what I was really thinking about a bit when, reading your book on Origen here. It's like, if you deprive somebody of their moral responsibility, you deprive them of who they are as a human being. Yeah. And that applies to all of us. Yes. That applies to all of us.
Exactly. No, God needs to be our prime example, right? So true help means empowerment, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Supporting agency.
Yeah. Oh. So, okay, yeah. We're back. Could you repeat that again? Because you kind of got frozen.
Yeah, so I'd say true help is empowerment, right? Improving what means, the indispensable means for autonomous agency. Mm-hmm. No? And that's what Origen's soteriology is about. So empowerment, enlightenment, so have the knowledge, right? No? So that people can evolve, can improve. This is what we need to do. So without this attitude, well, look, here we're coming, right? So helping the Scythians or the Parthians or whatever. So this is not what Origen opts for.
No,
because that means depriving them of their agency, right? And I'd say this is imperialism in the bad sense of the word, right? So we'll help you. So, and then you need to be grateful to us.
Yeah,
this is not what the Logos does.
Yeah.
He says, I want you to be friends. So I don't.
Who says this?
Want to, the Logos.
Yeah.
Himself. He said, so he doesn't want to be a shepherd.
Yeah.
First and foremost, he wants to help equals.
And Origen, this really comes out in his homilies, because you could tell in his homilies that he has a tremendous amount of frustration at times with his audience. Yeah. They rarely show up for the liturgy.
Yeah.
But what really emerges is him really trying hard to reach them on that intellectual level, saying, this is the Logos. When you don't come here to have to read the scriptures, to learn from them, you're being deprived of your spiritual nourishment and your this divine pedagogy. But he never uses force. You could tell he's trying to appeal to their reasoning capacity.
Yeah.
But he's never using force. He says, it's really up to you.
Yeah, exactly. Because God doesn't have any other agency than ours. And Origen being part of God's motion, right? Trying to contribute to it, participates.
That's right. Yeah.
That's an extraordinary idea again. So one of those ideas that are just striking, considering that they're of ancient pedigree, right? So it's extraordinary. You don't expect that.
And as much as, we could say, and I think Origen would be one of these, kind of pick yourself up by the bootstraps kind of guy.
Yeah.
His anthropology, he had a very profound social ethic. And I think this is what you get at with Cathy Cohn a little bit. Because to be a Christian, to be baptized, came with certain ethical responsibilities towards our fellow men, towards the Christian community, towards non-Christian communities. So this isn't a completely individualistic worldview. Would you say that? Would you say it's actually very quite, it's a dynamic of individual responsibility, but also communal ethics?
Yeah.
Would you say that's accurate?
I'd say so, yeah. So individualism is an important concept in Origen. So thanks to the Logos's pedagogy, because his pedagogy is such that it caters to everybody's every need, you see. And this is where this idea of every individual having their own concerns, their own needs, becomes a philosophical concept for the first time.
That's right.
So again, it's an extrapolation from Socratic and Stoic sources again, but it's taken to an extreme that is unheard of back in the day, I'd say. So again, this is what we find so frequently in Origen, right? So we've got these ancient ideas, but they take on a more radical meaning.
Yes.
Because he is such a systematic mind, I'd say. Huh?
Yeah, I would agree. And there's a lovely passage. Have you read any of his homilies on the Psalms, the new manuscript?
Yeah.
You have. Have you read his homily on Psalm 81?
Yeah, can you?
Pardon?
What is it exactly about? So I don't recall all of them.
So in his homily on Psalm 81, which is one of my favorites, it's on Psalm 82, modern day Psalm 82. You are gods in the assembly of the gods. So he's talking about deification and how human beings can be made divine in body, soul, and spirit. But he talks about how does this process happen, and there's the verse in there that's kind of sandwiched in between verse 1 and verse 7, which I think is the extent of the pericope that he's preaching on there. I think it's the extent of the psalm, where it says, what is it? Do justice to the orphan and the widow. I can't remember what else. But he takes up, there's a verse in there that the psalmist cries out, how long will you accept or take on the prosopa of the sinner? And Origen picks up on this. Mara Niehoff has a nice paper on this, where Origen keys on the term prosopon, and then he talks about the theater of the world, and how actors wear a mask, and he says, we have a choice as Christians, we can wear masks of the devil and the demons, or we can wear masks of God and Christ. And he says, well, to put on the mask of God and Christ means to be there to help our fellow people who are in need. And he says, sometimes, one person has property, but they lost it, and they lost it because we weren't there to help them. And he says, if you want to be a son of God, if you want to be deified, we need to be there. When we see somebody suffering, make it our business to do something to help. So it's not a complete atomistic view of the world where, I can only be concerned with myself. Your problems are your problems. But as a baptized community of believers, we are responsible to help each other. So I think that's an important distinction to make, that Origen isn't just a complete individualist in kind of like the extremist sense of the word. But he's got a very strong ethical understanding of what life in a community is like.
Exactly.
What else did I want to talk about today? Was there anything? Well, it's 11 o'clock, so I think we should probably wrap it up. I think we got through some of the important points of your book. Was there anything?
Definitely,
you add?
Well, thank you so much for
that we did
your thorough reading.
Yeah, no, this is,
I'm very honored.
I think this is a very important book. Get it a little closer there for the audience to see it. Baylor University Press has a series where they've been publishing English translations of German monographs. So like Christoph Markschies, for example, his book on Christian theology and its institutions was translated. And I'm thinking that this book might be important enough to warrant an English translation. So who knows, maybe one of these days I'll take up the task. I don't know. My German is okay. It's not great, but I think it's important. I think people need this because I think Origen is very relevant, I think, for today, as you bring out. And
preaching to the converted here, right? Yeah,
that's right. You can tell I get a little excited when I talk about Origen.
Yeah, me too. So I talk to him forever, basically. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hengstermann, for joining me today. I think this is a fantastic conversation, and I really hope anybody watching goes out and buys a copy of your book. It's well worth the price.
Thank you so much.
Yep, thank you.